The photograph had survived wars, floods, and careless hands, its edges softened by time, its surface dulled to the color of old bone. At first glance, it offered nothing unusual: a child seated stiffly on a carved wooden chair, boots polished, collar too tight, lips pressed into the obedient line common to studio portraits of the era. The backdrop was painted to resemble a parlor that never existed, a flat illusion meant to suggest warmth and domestic calm. Anyone passing it in an archive drawer would have moved on without a second thought, convinced they had already seen everything there was to see. It was only when the image was magnified, pixel by patient pixel, that the silence around it began to feel deliberate. The child's eyes, once thought dark simply from age and exposure, revealed depth where none should be. They did not reflect the studio lamps or the photographer's silhouette, but something narrower, more confined, as if the child were seated somewhere else entirely. The longer the expert stared, the more the reflections resisted interpretation, refusing to settle into any known geometry of light. What unsettled them most was not the strangeness itself, but the precision. The pupils were sharp, focused, almost alert in a way that contradicted the rigid posture of the body. It was the look of someone paying attention. Early explanations were offered quickly: chemical irregularities, emulsion flaws, the tricks of pareidolia, but each answer sounded rehearsed, as though meant to reassure rather than explain. When the image was rescanned using different equipment, the reflections remained, unchanged, waiting. The room grew quieter as the realization spread that the child's gaze did not rest on the camera at all. It seemed angled outward, beyond the frame, toward something that could not have been present in 1901. Some described the sensation of being observed in return, an irrational response they laughed off until they noticed they were no longer eager to be alone with the image. The photograph had not changed in over a century, yet now it felt newly aware, as if the act of looking closer had invited something closer in response. The digitization began as a routine preservation effort, the kind undertaken quietly in climate-controlled rooms where history is flattened into data and catalog numbers. The 1901 portrait was placed beneath a high-resolution scanner, its brittle paper trembling slightly as the lid descended. On the monitor, the image appeared as expected at first: the child's small frame, the rigid posture enforced by hidden braces, the neutral expression demanded by long exposure times. Nothing about it suggested urgency, and one of the technicians nearly marked it complete without further inspection. But archival protocol required extreme magnification, and it was during this slow, methodical zoom that the first inconsistency surfaced. The child's eyes, previously assumed to be darkened by age or poor lighting, did not behave like the rest of the photograph. As the resolution increased, the grain of the paper receded, replaced by an unnatural clarity in the pupils. Instead of dissolving into blur, they sharpened, revealing layers of detail that should not have survived a century of chemical decay. An anatomist was consulted to rule out optical illusion. A physicist followed, then a photographic historian. Each expert leaned closer to the screen, drawn by the same quiet wrongness. The pupils appeared too deep, not simply absorbing light but containing it, structured in a way that suggested depth rather than reflection. It was not the mirror-like glint expected from studio lamps of the era. The light within the eye seemed directional, angled, as though originating from a narrow corridor rather than an open room. Measurements were taken. The proportions were calculated and recalculated, revealing geometry inconsistent with the known studio setup. The reflection implied a confined space with vertical edges, something closer to a doorway than a backdrop. Even more troubling was the scale. Whatever appeared in the eyes was positioned at a distance that contradicted the child's seated posture. To reconcile it would require the subject to be standing somewhere else entirely, facing something unseen by the camera. Skepticism hardened into unease when the data refused to collapse under scrutiny. Software designed to detect compression artifacts found none. Chemical analysis of the emulsion showed no tampering, no later alteration. The image behaved as though the anomaly had always been there, patiently waiting for the technology capable of noticing it. The room took on a different atmosphere then, conversations lowering, movement slowing, as if sound itself might disturb whatever had been uncovered. One expert finally spoke what the others had been circling in silence: the eyes were not merely reflecting light, they were resolving a scene. And that scene did not belong to 1901, nor to any photographic process known to have existed at the time, but remained embedded there with impossible clarity, watching from within the child's gaze. Once the initial shock settled, attention shifted from the impossibility of the eyes to the content hidden inside them. High-contrast filters were applied, then reversed, then layered with spectral analysis meant to isolate wavelengths invisible to the naked eye. What emerged did not resemble the ornate clutter of a turn-of-the-century studio. There were no draped curtains, no potted palms, no brass light stands. Instead, the reflection suggested a narrow, elongated space, bordered by straight lines that felt industrial rather than decorative. The experts reconstructed the original studio from surviving records, blueprints, and period photographs. Every known angle was modeled in 3 dimensions, every plausible source of light accounted for. None of it aligned with what appeared in the child's eyes. The reflected space was too tall, too compressed, its surfaces too smooth. Even more unsettling was the apparent source of illumination, a single, cold glow positioned overhead, unlike the broad, diffused light required for early photographic exposures. As the image was enhanced further, shapes within the reflection gained definition. They resembled doors, or perhaps frames within frames, receding into darkness. The perspective implied depth far beyond the shallow confines of a portrait studio. One researcher suggested it looked like a hallway, a word that hung uncomfortably in the air once spoken. Hallways were transitional spaces, meant to be passed through, not lingered in, and certainly not preserved inside a child's gaze. The most alarming discovery came when temporal inconsistencies were identified. Certain edges within the reflection bore the crispness of materials that would not be manufactured for decades. The smoothness suggested machined surfaces, not hand-finished wood. When compared against architectural catalogues, the closest matches appeared in structures built well into the mid-20th century. The idea that a photograph from 1901 could contain a visual record of something not yet constructed forced the team into uneasy silence. Attempts were made to dismiss the scene as coincidence, a pattern misread by the human mind's hunger for meaning. Yet the geometry remained stubbornly precise, repeating across both eyes with slight parallax, as true reflections do. This was no random artifact. It obeyed the rules of optics too faithfully to be ignored. The child's pupils were acting like lenses, capturing a moment that existed somewhere else, sometime else. As the team debated, one technician overlaid a modern photograph of an abandoned institutional corridor taken during an unrelated survey. The alignment was not perfect, but close enough to chill the room. The angles, the spacing, even the fall of light shared an unsettling resemblance. No one could explain how the eyes of a child in 1901 could reflect a place that should not exist yet, or why the child appeared to be looking directly into it, as though aware of a passage opening beyond the frame. The discovery of the reflection changed how the photograph was treated, transforming it from an archival curiosity into a documented object of concern. Every known record of ownership was traced, every hand it had passed through catalogued with renewed interest. What began as routine provenance research soon drifted into uncomfortable territory when patterns emerged that had nothing to do with paper quality or storage conditions. Marginal notes in accession logs mentioned disturbed sleep, unexplained anxiety, and requests to relocate the image away from general collections. The earliest account surfaced in a handwritten letter from a private collector dated 1912, in which he described dreams of standing in a narrow passage with no visible end, guided only by a light that never grew closer. He dismissed the experience as nerves, yet noted that the dreams began only after the portrait was hung in his study. Decades later, a museum conservator recorded a similar sensation in a personal diary, describing the child's eyes as following thought rather than movement, a phrase that unsettled modern researchers when it resurfaced. As the accounts accumulated, the similarities became harder to ignore. Those who spent prolonged time examining the photograph reported nearly identical dreams, regardless of background or belief. The setting never varied, a confined corridor, smooth walls, a muted overhead glow. In every case, the dreamer felt compelled to walk forward, driven by a sense of expectation rather than fear. Awakening brought no relief, only the lingering impression that the passage continued somewhere beyond sleep. Psychologists were consulted to explore the possibility of suggestion or shared narrative contamination. Their conclusions offered little comfort. Many of the reports predated any public discussion of the reflection, eliminating the likelihood of influence. Some individuals had no knowledge of others' experiences, yet described the same spatial details with disturbing precision. Even those skeptical of the phenomenon admitted that coincidence could not account for such consistency across decades. What deepened the unease was the after effect. Several individuals noted subtle changes in waking perception following the dreams. Hallways seemed longer than they should be. Artificial lighting felt oppressive, too focused. A few described moments of disorientation in familiar buildings, as if expecting a turn that was not there. None of these effects were severe enough to prompt medical intervention, but together they formed a quiet, pervasive pattern. The research team began to limit exposure, rotating personnel to prevent prolonged study. Yet even brief interactions proved sufficient. One archivist reported the dream after handling the photograph for less than an hour, having been unaware of any prior accounts. The image itself appeared unchanged, still and compliant beneath glass, but the sense grew that it was not passive. The photograph did not merely depict a child from the past, it seemed to establish a shared mental space, one entered unwillingly by those who looked too closely, a place that waited patiently, illuminated by a light that offered no warmth and no exit. In an effort to contain speculation, the team turned to physiology, searching for a mechanism that could account for both the visual anomaly and the psychological aftereffects. Advanced imaging compared the child's eyes to hundreds of other portraits from the same era, analyzing curvature, light absorption, and grain behavior at microscopic levels. The results were unsettling not because they suggested illness or defect, but because the eyes behaved inconsistently across time. Scans taken years apart did not match precisely, even when conducted under identical conditions. At first, the discrepancies were dismissed as calibration errors. Machines age, software updates alter interpretation, and human expectations can shape what is noticed. To eliminate variables, the photograph was sent to multiple independent laboratories across different countries. Each lab worked in isolation, using distinct equipment and methodologies. When the results were returned, the same inconsistency appeared. The reflection within the eyes had shifted subtly, as if the angle of observation had changed without the photograph itself moving. The change was almost imperceptible, detectable only through precise overlay comparisons. A vertical line within the reflected space appeared fractionally closer in later scans. The overhead light source seemed marginally brighter, its falloff altered by a few measured units. No physical explanation could account for this. Paper does not rearrange itself. Chemical reactions do not selectively reshape reflected geometry while leaving surrounding areas untouched. Attempts to anchor the anomaly to biological explanation failed quickly. The child's eye showed no sign of known conditions that could produce layered reflections or depth illusions. Optical theories collapsed under scrutiny. What remained was a phenomenon that behaved less like an artifact and more like an active system, responding to observation rather than existing independently of it. The most troubling evidence emerged when older scans were re-examined. What had once been interpreted as static detail now appeared incomplete, as if earlier versions of the reflection were less developed. The corridor seemed shorter, the sense of depth reduced. Over time, the space within the eyes appeared to be extending. This implied not degradation, but accumulation, a gradual expansion captured in still images taken years apart. Faced with this, the team attempted controlled observation windows, limiting how often and how long the photograph was scanned. Yet even with reduced exposure, the changes continued. It became difficult to escape the impression that the act of study itself contributed to the phenomenon, as though attention fed whatever process was unfolding within the image. The physiological framework that once promised grounding now offered only further disquiet. If the eyes could change without physical alteration, then the photograph was not bound by the same rules as other objects. It did not simply preserve a moment from 1901. It behaved as though it existed in a different temporal relationship, one in which the past remained open, adjusting itself incrementally, as if making room for something still approaching through the narrow, illuminated space embedded in the child's gaze. The final realization did not arrive dramatically, but through a slow erosion of alternatives. Weeks passed without new tests, yet the unease intensified, fed by the quiet accumulation of data that refused to behave. It was during a routine comparison, one meant only to confirm stability, that the shift in understanding occurred. A recent scan was aligned against a version captured nearly a decade earlier, and for the first time the reflected corridor did not simply appear longer. Its perspective now matched the angle of the modern scanning room with unsettling precision. Measurements were taken again, this time not of the photograph, but of the space around it. The overhead lighting, the height of the ceiling, the distance between walls. When these dimensions were mapped onto the geometry inside the child's eyes, the correspondence was no longer abstract. The reflected space was not echoing a place from the future or the past. It was approximating the present environment of observation, adjusting itself as conditions changed. This prompted a controlled experiment. The photograph was relocated to a smaller room, lit differently, with narrower walls. Days later, a new scan revealed subtle but undeniable alterations. The overhead glow within the eyes had softened, its spread mirroring the reduced light source. Vertical lines in the reflection drew closer together. The corridor was no longer generic. It was becoming specific. What followed was silence, heavy and collective. If the eyes were reflecting the current surroundings, then the photograph was not preserving an external scene at all. It was resolving whatever stood before it, using the observer's space as its reference. Yet the angle remained wrong. The child was not looking at the camera, nor at the people studying the image. The gaze was directed slightly behind them, toward the space they had just occupied moments before. The implications were harder to articulate than any technical failure. A reflection implies reciprocity, a loop of light between subject and object. But here, the exchange felt delayed, as though the image required time to process what it observed. The expanding corridor, the recurring dreams, the shifting geometry all pointed to a single conclusion that none of the data explicitly stated, yet all of it supported. The photograph was not recording history. It was accommodating presence. The child's eyes functioned as a threshold, slowly reconstructing the environment of those who studied it, not as a mirror, but as a place of assembly. The corridor was not leading somewhere else. It was forming in response to attention, lengthening as more was given, stabilizing only when observed, as though preparing a space meant to be entered rather than merely seen.